Alrighty. Welcome everybody. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm the director of the Gillenhorn Institute for Israel Studies.
I think we know.
You know, but the people at home perhaps don't know because we have a wonderful following on YouTube. So that's, I'd like to thank each and every one of you, which is a lot, for attending today's talk. I'd like also to thank Avis for all that she does for us at the Institute. She's truly the linchpin of the program. For the past 7 months or so, we've been exploring multiple angles or dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to a rather unusual take on the conflict. Food, cuisines, cookbooks is an additional domain where the conflict manifests itself. So before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to briefly describe what he'll talk about, and then he knows what he's supposed to talk about today. He might be quite confused. Food is not just sustenance. It's a cultural artifact that reflects a community's history, identity, and aspirations. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where political tensions and military conflict have often overshadowed other aspects, food remained a powerful, contested field. And in fact, we have some food here that might be kind of triggering in that regard, might be controversial. Hummus, pita bread, falafel, and so on and so forth. So by delving into the history of food in the region and its socio-political significance, this talk aims to showcase how food practices have been used by both Israelis and Palestinians to make claims over ownership and authenticity. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Ilan Zvi Baron to campus. He's a professor of international political theory at Durham University in the UK, where he's also the co-director of the Center for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society, and Politics. He completed his doctorate at the University of Wales in 2007, where he was the E.H. Carr Scholar and recipient of an overseas research scheme grant. Professor Baron's research explores different ways that we experience international politics in our daily lives. To date, he has written on post-truth politics, the Jewish diaspora's relationship with Israel, and the international cultural politics of Israeli cuisine, the topic of today. In addition, he has written on violence, the ethics of war, identity, security, and international relations theory. He's currently working on a long-term research project about political responsibility and dystopian novels. This project is a continuation of his work on post-truth politics. He will speak for about 30 minutes or so, then we'll open the floor for Q&A. Ilan, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming.
Great, thanks Eli, and thank you everybody for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Eli and I have known each other since 2003, and it's been just a real pleasure to have known him for so long, and I'm just really honored that we're still friends and discuss stuff like this, because we met actually at a conference that brought Israelis, Palestinians, and Europeans together to discuss the conflict, and unfortunately here we are many years later still discussing the conflict. I'm going to try and tell you a story about the politics of food, and the story is going to be done in a few parts. Some will be a bit more theoretical, and some will be a bit more personal, and some of it will obviously focus more explicitly on the conflict, on questions of cultural appropriation, violence, identity, authority, authenticity, and other political theory concepts which I think are relevant. But I want to start a little bit about how I got interested into the politics of food. So there is, I'm sure many of you know, a whole field of food studies. It's heavily populated by anthropologists and by historians. It's not really very common to find scholars in political science or international relations studying food unless doing food security. And food security is not something which I want to talk about. Food security is really more about the ways in which food is distributed and how that distribution then relates to scarcity. What I'm going to talk about is different and stems from my own non-academic background, which is I went to culinary school for a year. And So I have this is some of the stuff I've produced over the years. I have this whole other background in cooking, in cuisine, and actually when I was in culinary school, I won the award for best in cooking theory, which I think sort of told me I was going to keep going on the theory route. And something interesting I feel happened in the sort of the past few years that speaks to the question of Israeli food. So I was born in Canada. My mother's Israeli, she's from Hadera. I went to Hablanim camps for many years, went to Israel Hablanim all before I went to cooking school. So I've lived on a few kibbutzim. I've been to Israel many times as a kid, and I can tell you when I went there as a kid, the food was terrible. Not only was it terrible, they didn't even have ketchup. They fed me chips, French fries with some disgusting grayish paste they called hummus, and I was like, what is this? I want ketchup. They all deny that you can get ketchup back in the 80s, but you actually couldn't. Eventually, I had some non-Heinz brand of ketchup by some weird company called Osem, which tasted absolutely disgusting. And then when I lived there as a teenager on kibbutz, I think I was trying to figure out how to put this on a slide, but if you imagine chicken and you were to sort of cut it right down, sort of slice it through, almost, I don't know, as you're cutting right down the backbone, and you're to see sort of like a cross-section of a chicken. Now imagine a steak that's a cross-section of a chicken, and have some idea of what that would look like. Well, whatever they sold in kibbutz did not look like that, but it was supposed to be chicken steak, and it was disgusting. And the food in Israel was never an exciting type of product, right? And that's not surprising. Israel's a settler colonial society, and they needed food basically to sustain the building of a state. Right? There wasn't any time for kind of upper class commercialization, take your different descriptors that explain the development of haute cuisine. There wasn't anything like that. You wouldn't be going out to restaurants to experience that type of food. If you were, you were basically going to Arab restaurants for shikudim and various kinds of shishlik and things like that. And of course, falafel, pita bread, some of the food we've had here, there'll be discussions for which Arab village had best hummus, and you would drive, there, and pick up your hummus, go home, and that was sort of the extent of it, right? And the Israeli breakfast, the Israeli dinner, which you can see there on my right side of the screen, that was basically your fare. But something changed around the time of this cookbook. And I was very interested in this. Aside from the types of recipes which Ottolenghi produces, and I'm happy to talk cooking techniques and all that with you if you want in the Q&A. I'm more happy to discuss recipes and things like that. But Ottolenghi's recipes are complicated. There's a lot of ingredients in them. He's an incredibly talented chef. But there is an interesting style to it that doesn't immediately make it highly popular. But clearly, he was writing this at a particular moment. The zeitgeist was there for him, and also he was very successful, right, in London. And that's partially owing to the kind of food culture in London, and again, him coming up at a time when there was an interest in better types of food. Food in London used to be terrible. London now is an amazing gastronomic city if you can afford it. And Ottolenghi spoke of Jerusalem, which she wrote with his Palestinian partner, Sami Tamimi, business partner. It really spoke not only to that time, at least in the UK, but also to a really happy narrative of a Jewish Israeli, a Palestinian, who both lived and grew up in Jerusalem, working together to demonstrate here is the combined products of our culinary history. And that's a very lovely story. It's a story that could only be produced outside Israel. And it was written in English. And I don't think it's been translated into Hebrew or into Arabic. Ottolenghi has spoken and he has made other gestures towards Palestinian cooking, and there's the Gaza, it's called the Gaza Kitchen, there's another interesting cookbook. But this book I thought was very interesting. At what point did Israeli cuisine become a product for export? And this isn't just a book for the Jewish diaspora. Okay, I mean he's famous in the UK. This book is famous in the UK, which does not have the same percentage of the Jewish population that the United States does. This is a very popular book, and there's something interesting going on here. So what exactly is going on here? Now, that's the background. The sort of theoretical, methodological questions that I think matter here, coming to this as a international political theorist, as a political theorist, are about authenticity, about commodification, about appropriation. I'm going to talk about food washing, which is a term that Galia Pless-Valentin and I coined in a cooperative article, and also how cookbooks reaffirm spatial and identity claims. Cookbooks and food is political. And if anybody has any doubt about that, I suggest you do at least one of two things. One is have a seminar where you ask about what foods best describe your ethnic, national, religious identity and see what happens. And I have seminars like this in the UK. Curry becomes a huge one. There's no such thing as curry, not really. It's a British colonial invention. Obviously tea becomes an interesting topic of discussion, product of Britain's colonialism. Coffee actually used to be a drink that was more popular until some of the colonial adventurers brought tea back. There's an Italian class, so I think we all agree that Italian food is the best there is anywhere. It's amazing how people connect so fundamentally to food in ways that really speak to questions of political identity that are clearly outside of what you're consuming, right? And you can see, I even remember as a kid having discussions, with friends after shul about whose parents made the best hummus. And it's interesting, if you attend an Ashkenazi congregation, why are they serving hummus? Right? It's not an Ashkenazi food. And I remember when I wrote a piece about, I was asked to write about International Falafel Day, there was such a thing for Haaretz, the English edition, and I write this article about Israeli food and cultural appropriation, stuff like that, and I get someone commented about how, of course you steal you stole everything else of ours, of course you steal our food is delicious, all you have is gefilte fish. Okay, so that was a great comment. The other thing is, it's interesting, this is a book I saw today, it's about American cuisine. This is in the Library of Congress bookshop. And it's talking about how there's such a thing as American cuisine. And I thought this is very interesting as a little prop. I can't obviously do a cooking demonstration today. But this is very interesting. This gets into one of the important points about discussing food and politics, which is whether or not we can even make a nationalist claim to there being a particular cuisine. So we talk about French cuisine, Japanese cuisine, Mexican cuisine, American cuisine, Israeli cuisine, Palestinian. But if you do a very brief scan of the relevant key texts, there's debate on this. So then the two, I think, major texts here, major authors here, I should say, are Sidney Mintz, a historian, Arjuna Padarai, an anthropologist, and although they're both arguing different things, I would suggest they're actually in agreement, despite their seeming disagreement. Mintz says there's no such thing as a national cuisine. Why? Because state borders don't reflect where foods come from, right? The borders of jurisdictional sovereignty are not going to represent the borders of pastry. The national cuisines, according to Padarai, are political projects, and she's talking. Padarai is talking specifically about. He's talking specifically about Indian food and the idea how within Indian cuisine, there isn't Indian cuisine, there's only regional cuisines, but the production of Indian cookbooks become part of India's project of producing a nation state. And effectively you have here two arguments that are largely saying the same thing, right? Food, if there's such a thing as a national food, it is a political project. So let's have a brief look at some of the ways in which this political project of food speaks to the case that I'm interested in here today. Well, I mentioned already how my own experience of Israeli food as a teenager, as a kid, but Israel wasn't great. And this is sort of an illustration of the type of cookery texts that would have been produced that demonstrate how basically every kind of Israeli dish up probably until, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago was some version of a pashtidah. Some sort of casserole or tuna something surprise is probably the best way to translate that. Could be a quiche.
That book was from the 30s.
I'm sorry?
That book is from the 1930s.
Yeah. But it speaks to the same idea of having to produce food for the construction of a state. We are not producing food for the construction of a commodity good. And there's and I wish I brought it with me, and I forgot to put it on the slide. There's a newish cookbook, in Israel, in Hebrew, called Chadav Ochel, Dining Room. And it's a cookbook that just collects recipes from kibbutz dining rooms. Which in one, when I first heard this is really weird. Who's going to want this? I mean, you're just going to have, probably salads, maybe some kind of pashtadot, and almost certainly some kind of compote, basically stewed fruits. And you're going to tell people how to make pickled eggs? I just thought this is not, but they've romanticized the dining hall. So you have recipes, and actually the grandmother of my cousin's wife is in it. You have recipes from all these different kibbutzim. There's a picture, of the person, who worked in the dining hall, almost always a woman, right, and what she cooked, and there's, the recipe, and maybe a story about the kibbutz. And it's actually a really lovely book, and it's repackaged in this very interesting kind of, capitalist way. The types of foods that initially were not produced for capitalism, but were produced for state building. Now, the case that I've been looking at in regard to the production of Israeli cuisines and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are not Hebrew language cookbooks, right? Unlike this one and Chadav Ochel, they're cookbooks like Jerusalem, which are written for a non-Israeli audience. They're written, number one, in English, although there was one which was actually, I found it was written in Lithuanian, and then translated into English, and that was a curious case. But they're, for the most part, English language texts. They're not translated. And that's important because it tells us something about who these books are being written for. And what I'm going to talk about that follows is built on this article I co-wrote with Galia Pestel-Natan from Hebrew University. It's published in International Political Sociology. And it's about food waste and food washing, Israeli cookbooks, and the politics of culinary Zionism, which is a riff on cultural Zionism. And what we found in these English language cookbooks were two types of narratives. One is the issue of Israeli and Palestinian existence in Israel and how, through their divided and overlapping foodways, either they can find some way for them to come together, or maybe there's just some everlasting conflict. And then the second one is how our cookbooks that are really focused specifically for tourists. And I'm going to go through some examples of those. Before I do that, though, I want to talk a little bit about some of these concepts. So firstly, cookbooks, as I'm treating them, are not just recipe repositories, and they're not instructional manuals. And I have a lot of cookbooks that are both or either recipe repositories or basically textbooks. And these sort of cookbooks are neither of those things. They are cookbooks that speak to a particular production of, in this case, a claim to belonging in a particular space. So they have the spatial and identity claims. The second part of it is that these cookbooks seemingly provide some kind of authentic representation of the foodways of these spaces and the foodways that speak to these identity claims. What actually defines it as being authentic is, of course, highly contentious. And I think the Jerusalem cookbook is a really good example of how authenticity is produced. In this case, it's produced through a claim of ownership. Ownership because the authors are from Jerusalem, so they can claim to speak to the foods that they grew up with. And that gives it some kind of additional degree of authenticity. The third theoretical component is really important is that of commodification. And here I'm really building off of probably Benjamin's essay, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And one of the things that Benjamin points out in that essay is once you reproduce art, it's no longer the artist that's producing it, it's not being reproduced for the masses. The very character of the art itself dramatically changes. And it's a great essay, really, I think it's actually probably one of the easiest ones to read as well. But that transformation is very important because what it means is we now have a question. It is no longer art that, and this is what, regardless of the art, it is no longer a question of what the artist is trying to produce, a question of what that art itself represents. It is now a question of the commodification. The commodification, it means that the artist now speaks to the various facets that define capitalism. It speaks to consumerism. It changes the very character of that which is being produced. So the question we have here is, what is the character of these new cookbooks what is the character of these recipes? What is the character of the good that these cookbooks seemingly represent? Because the cookbooks are no longer just cookbooks. There's something else going on here. And the last one, I'll talk about food washing later, but the last one I want to mention now is appropriation. We all know what that is, basically taking a good of one culture and claiming it as your own. I mentioned what is the commodification question and what is going on in these sort of cookbooks that really clearly emphasize that we are not just talking about a book that's going to tell you how to make, I don't know, ugaschnapping or something, Franz cake or yeast cake. I'm going to start talking about Zahav, who, and I know Michael Solomon has been in the news lately because of what's been going on in Gaza and Israel and some of the donations he's been making. When I found Zahav, I didn't know much about him, but I'd never been to his restaurant with the same name in Philadelphia. It's a very interesting cookbook because of how it starts. It starts with a story, not about where, farm to table, or not about some magical herbs that they discovered and like za'atar or something. It starts with a personal story about basically how Michael Solomon was probably had a rough young adulthood, in kitchens, moving around. I suspect there were drugs involved, and I know what the kind of I've worked in restaurants, and but there's another story there as well about his family. And he's basically American, but Israeli parents, brother served in the army. His brother dies in Lebanon in a Hezbollah ambush. This is in the introduction to the cookbook. I'm not sure about you, but normally if I'm leafing through a cookbook, I'm not looking for a story about how a relative of the author died in a war in whatever country, and how that death in Lebanon by Hezbollah, because his brother was basically providing young people cover for someone else, somehow produced a desire to reconnect to a country which otherwise I didn't know, Michael, he had no connection with. That's how this cookbook starts, which I think is curious because that's not a best-selling way to open up a book about a traumatic death in a questionable military context. Yet, that's the introduction. This is not, at this point, this is clearly not just a cookbook anymore. It's now a story. It's a story about Michael's connection to Israel. It's a story also that speaks in an indirect way to Israel's presence in Lebanon, military presence in Lebanon. It highlights Hezbollah. Well, who are they? Why, all these sort of political, geopolitical, international relations, ethics of war questions effectively are in the introduction without any of that kind of political analysis. And I thought this is very interesting. So this starts as a political text, as does Jerusalem, which in the end of the cookbook, by Ilan Zvi, where at the conclusion of the introduction, they talk about, and I think this is their line, peace through hummus. If you could only just sort of get together and recognize each other's shared food ways and shared appreciation of each other's food ways, maybe we could have a positive and peaceful future. The book Honey & Co., another London-based restaurant. I've met the chefs and owners, really, really interesting people. The cookbook is clearly an Israeli cookbook, but it is not described as one. The geography that they reference is not exclusively Israeli, although it is mostly Israeli. The recipes are, the falafel actually is a really good example of this because they talk about falafel, different styles of falafel, including Yemeni falafel, and the book sort of gives this idea of Israel's foodways coming from the Middle Eastern region, not just from whatever Israel's borders might be. The Jerusalem cookbook does, in a way, something similar. Zahav also does something similar, but expands that border to basically include the Jewish diaspora. And there's even a film, In Search of Israeli Cuisine, which Solomon narrated, and he kind of gives this sort of discussion where you can see all these different foods from all these different countries, all being served in one place, and isn't this amazing? It's like, yeah, okay, there's a bit more to it than that, but we'll leave it at that. And then you have this other cookbook called Divine Food, and I have I've got a quote from a different cookbook. And Divine Food is another sort of example of this week, trying to bring both Israelis and Palestinians together through their shared foodways, or at least through some ability to recognize just how rich and wonderful each other's food contributions are. There's another example. This is the one I've got a quote from. This is the Arab-Israeli cookbook, which I thought was a very interesting title by Robin Soanes, I think, or Soanes, I think, Soanes. And here's this passage, I've had to modify this a little bit, but for Palestinians, the recipes in this book represent an affirmation of cultural identity, the dream of independent state. For Israelis whose parents are from Arab lands, they evoke ancestral memories and vanished worlds. And I think that speaks very nicely to this idea of what you could call food diplomacy. And there are some literature on food diplomacy or gastro diplomacy or whatever you want to call it. There's some variations. But the underlying idea of all of them is to use food to try to bring people together, right? And it can work to an extent, but it's limited in how far it can go because food doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? There's always another context that people are bringing to the table, which leads to the second narrative. The Zionist tourist narrative. And I'm just going to give this one example because it's such a powerful and evocative one that speaks to just how political food can be. This is the book of New Israeli Food by Yana Yazgo, and it's a kind of book that you're going to see at Ben Gurion Airport. I'm just going to read this quote from the book. So here she's talking about what is New Israeli food, or Israeli food. The early settlers, so I think we know what she's talking about here. The early settlers were idealistic youngsters, driven by the vision of building a homeland for their long-suffering people. This meant severing ties with the recent past, ones representing suffering and humiliation, the language, music, customs, and foods of the diaspora. For inspiration, the early settlers looked to their Arab neighbors whose appearance and lifestyle they felt represented the continuation of the biblical Hebrew. Incidentally, they were not mistaken, as current research indicates that Arab peasants and shepherds have indeed preserved many cultural traditions that go back to the age of biblical Israel. Or in other words, Palestinian populations, unbeknownst to themselves, are really just saving Jewish culture to be taken up later by the Yeshua, which is incredibly offensive, I think, to anybody. And also, this is real, it's a cookbook, but it's still really questions a really questionable narrative, right? Idealistic youngsters driven by a vision of, negating the diaspora. Yeah, sort of, but it's not as simple as this, right? And the kind of this idea of, the Jewish victim that, lives in, that's from the diaspora and from, Galut and this strong, Zionist pioneer. These are very problematic narratives, which don't really speak at all to, a lot of Israel's treatment of, Holocaust survivors and, Israel's relationship with diaspora Jewry over the years. And I don't know. I can certainly tell you that, from my own experience speaking to my relatives, when they went to Palestine, they were not looking to their Arab neighbors in this way. Maybe some did, but it's a Zionist narrative that allows you to feel good about the types of violence that were required in order to build a state. And this is where the political scientist in me comes up, which is states are inherently violent entities. You know, when people ask me what is international relations, in the UK, international relations exists almost as a separate discipline in a way, as opposed to subfield political science, which is how it's framed in the United States. When people ask me what is international relations, I say, international relations is the field that explains why there's always money for guns and not for healthcare. The state is an inherently violent beast. And it's not just Weber's definition that matters here. States are exclusionary. They are built, yes, on the monopoly of legitimate use of force, but of course that legitimate use of force is often deployed against its own populations. States are the entities that largely pay for nuclear bombs and carpet bombing and all sorts of very, very nasty things. Structural violence, overt violence. The state is, in effect, a violent entity, regardless of all the good that they also produce. And that really matters when you start to think about this connection that exists between national foods and politics. And it's not a judgment, although there are judgments involved in here. I think it's something that we need to acknowledge and then work through. So with these different narratives of food and Israeli cuisines, we have here, I think, the obvious acknowledgement that food is really powerful, right? And there are books about Palestinian cuisine which have tried over the years to sort of reclaim their own culinary histories, which are really important to Palestinians who, in a lot of these texts and in other forums, have highlighted how they have so little left. Trying at least to preserve their food culture becomes really, really important to them. And I think we can understand that. And the commodification element, right? If Israel becomes a place where its food products are now so appealing, they can produce entire genres of cookbooks for sale, right? At this point, we're no longer just in the, here are some interesting culinary goods that you might want to take home because you really enjoy the food on your travels. We're now talking about something much greater than that. We now have a good for international export that's fulfilling a particular element within the various processes of capital and the mechanisms through which people then become consumers of particular goods, which in Israeli context is also very interesting. Because once they're going for food out in restaurants and fancy restaurants, that previous type of culture now doesn't exist, and you have a whole other element which can be exported. The cultural appropriation, it's pretty obvious, right? That a lot of the foods in Israel are produced by an engagement with the local Palestinian foodways, but often that engagement is unacknowledged and is just taken. The little postcards of pita bread with falafel and an Israeli flag in them, or is a really good example of that. And while there are often acknowledgements, there's a question about how meaningful this actually is. So and this is where the food washing element comes into play. I'm almost finished. This is the last slide. The food washing idea, as Gali and I presented, is how food becomes a way to gloss over the violence of the conflict. That you can talk about this fantastically rich, diverse cultural product, this commodity, like Michael Solomonov does, and somehow through that acknowledgement of this multicultural product, you don't have to think through everything that was necessary in order to produce that good, or the consequences of presenting the good in that particular way. And that's the point that we're trying to make about food washing. Intention doesn't really matter here. Not in the case, not insofar as at least that we discussed it, and I think as I'm concerned with. What matters more is the actual process itself and the meaning that is produced through these processes, which also tell us, importantly, that mundane stuff really, really matters, right? Food matters. It's not just something that you put on the table, it's not just something you eat, it's not just a mundane element of everyday life. The banal nationalism of culinary products are really important things that we need to take seriously. In so doing, we need to be very reflexive about what we are producing, where these goods are coming from, the meanings that we are then applying to these particular goods, and how they then speak to wider geopolitical or other conflicts in this case. But we also need to recognize two additional points that were really, really important in discussing and debating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and something which we are seeing now in the United States, at least on campuses, but certainly it's not unique to the craziness that's been going on, are these two discourses around victimhood and power. One, the claim there's righteousness in victimhood, and two, a discomfort with the consequence of having power or somehow reveling in having the apparatus of power, of state power. And culinary, the Israeli cuisine, the production of Israeli cuisine speaks to these things, right? That we can look at how, if you want to buy into the particular Zionist narrative, you can make a narrative around how there's a particular righteousness in being able to produce these kind of narratives around Israeli cuisine, right, without having to think through where that comes from. The Chal book I mentioned, I think, speaks in a way to that, although not explicitly and certainly not intentionally. But also, if we're going to acknowledge that there are cultural appropriations here, what does it actually mean in practice? And if you're going to do that, you have to really acknowledge the responsibility that comes with the power to claim ownership and to claim authenticity or authority over particular culinary goods or other cultural goods. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to open the floor. Marsha, the Vatika, will go first.
Thank you. Probably also the oldest in the room.
I didn't want to wait that way.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed it. And as an owner of the Ottolenghi cookbook, I sort of recognize some of the things he said about it and about the other cookbooks. And food is a potent. I think that we all know that food is a very potent both symbol and artifact of various kinds of things. But it's also more complicated, and you probably know that. For example, people do joke that kosher food, for example, is the food of the region in which Jews lived made kosher. So the process of borrowing, of appropriating, is done by powerless people too, not just by states, not just by powerful people. So, what most Ashkenazi Jews in North America think of as Jewish food is simply East European food without the pork, right? There's nothing that Jews eat, except for challah, that is not Eastern European food. And so, so it's not totally surprising, that the early settlers, would start eating some Palestinian foods, because that's what they always did, right? They always ate the food of their neighbors. And in the American context, non-Jews, of course, borrow each other's food all the time. Who doesn't eat lasagna? Who doesn't eat what's called Chinese food? Much of it invented. Or even bagels and lox, which were invented in New York. They weren't even invented in Eastern Europe. So, my point is, I'm not criticizing what you said, because I think what you said is very important and so on. But I think that food also does other things. There's a borrowing. One could say appropriation, that's a hostile word, but one could also say borrowing, which is not a hostile word. And we borrow food all the time, right? There is no American cuisine because Americans are a country of immigrants and we eat each other's foods. I can't think of any food that is just American, except, I don't know, maybe hamburgers and hot dogs or something. But apple pie, no, the British eat apple pie too.
Cheese whiz is probably American.
Cheese, it's so disgusting. I don't consider
cheese
food.
with a Z.
I don't consider that food yet Velveeta of my childhood.
I think
it's really crap.
I think you probably disagree, right? This is the interesting question. Is that?
Well, that's true. I haven't seen that cookbook, but I would assume that it has a lot of African American recipes.
This isn't a cookbook.
And so forth. What?
This is an academic work about the production of food that is American, right? I think you're right that there is something about borrowing that's different from appropriation, but the difference becomes when you claim the difference in this case is I'm not talking about the application of halakha to local foodways that can maintain your religious identity. I'm talking about the production of a national product, right? And I think there's two very different questions there. I think the boring question, I think the boring question is not one that even occurred to me because my training is so caught up in questions of power. And
I'm a social historian. I'm interested.
And that's, yeah.
I'm interested in day-to-day interrelations.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're, I think the boring question doesn't speak to where I started with, the idea of a national cuisine. I think the boring question speaks much more to the sociology of local experiences of the foods, as opposed to we're going to take this food and transform it. But that's not something which I can comment on with any expertise in this context, although I think you're right. I also think that raises a question here about, is there a space, disciplinarily speaking, for international political theorists, political science, people in poli-sci departments to be looking at food, right? And where does power start to become important when you're talking about the productions of food? And I think historians and people like yourselves have been acknowledged the importance here well in advance of those in I guess my disciplinary homeland. That's a good point.
Oh, the front, sir.
Hi, thank you. It was very interesting. I was late, so maybe you talked about what I'm going to ask. I was wondering, because I paid attention recently that in these conflicts in Israel-Palestine, that there is also the use of Arab Jewish food to contradict I don't know what, but there is the use of these kitchens to say something about authenticity, and I wonder how the relationship between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi food in Israel changed during the years for the use of political interest of the Zionist movement or the State of Israel, or for example, when we talk about the displacement of Palestinians, so many times they'll say, yeah, but there was a displacement of Arab Jews as well. Like this kind of parallels in the context of food. So I wonder how it takes place in this discourse.
That's a good question. I think it speaks to the point I ended on about questions around power and victimhood and which narrative takes precedence. So the interesting thing about the production, about these cookbooks and the production of Israeli cuisine is the types of foods that you find within them are very diverse, right? It's not like at least in the English language ones. You don't find Israeli cookbook is only Mizrahi or only Ashkenazi.
But
it's a mix.
Maybe changing from the 50s to the 80s.
Yeah, but that's a different question. I mean, I'm not a historian. I wasn't looking at all of, what I'm interested in here are the politics of English language Israeli cookbooks and how they represent particular narratives of Israel and of the conflict, which is, those are the examples which I was, providing. Within that context, there's obviously significant input, into whatever we want to place within the Israeli cuisine mantle of, Yemeni Jewish contributions, Mizrahi Jewish contributions, Sephardic Jewish contributions, Ashkenazi Jewish contributions, and obviously whatever Palestinian contributions are there as well. And that mixture, I think, is what makes Israeli cuisine such an interesting type of cuisine. Mm-hmm. The national question, what makes it Israeli, though, cannot exist without also acknowledging that these foods belong to a variety of different people. Mm-hmm. And the people involved here are going to be all of those who I just mentioned, right? So you have a question there around what that shared ownership means. And if the questions start to emphasize, well, what is the Yemeni contribution? What is, my contribution? What is the Mizrahi or Sephardic or, et cetera contribution? It ends up emphasizing, the significance of particular identity group as opposed to the wider contributions of all the identity groups and how that itself contributes to something itself that is special. And because I'm Canadian, right, in Canada we have a very different idea around diversity than, you have in the United States, the idea of the melting pot. But, looking at the melting pot is in a way an idea that sort of represents this greater new good that is produced through a bunch of different people coming together without necessarily isolating, one contribution being more important than the other. I think we can all admit that that is BS. If the melting pot actually existed, you wouldn't have the types of, extreme polarization around like black lives and blue lives, for example, right? Because there wouldn't be any black or blue lives. You wouldn't have red or blue. As Obama said, you would have, the United States of America, not divided states of America. And that's sort of the problematic here, that when we start to emphasize the contributions of particular groups, it's usually done not because you're saying, hey, look at the wonderful goods that we brought in, we're important too. It's usually done because you're trying to say, hey, you're focusing on them, they're not as important as my people are. And that's how the nationalist narratives that we see in these cookbooks often function. Now, except for things like Divine Food or I think the Honey cookbooks are interesting on this because they're so careful in not falling into that trap. For them, it's regional. And if it's regional, you never can make an exclusive claim to national identity. And that's the Mintz point. And also, in a way, it's the Haderach point, right? The idea of there ever existing a homogeneous national group that can lay claim to a particular good within an exclusive geographical territory is a fiction of modernity, which we latch onto because it serves certain political purposes that give our world a kind of meaning, as opposed to acknowledging how that meaning is inherently violent. And maybe we might want to think differently about the place of diversity within that political construction. So I think the real point here isn't who has contributed more or less. The point is, how are we deciding whose contributions matter and what does that say about us? And that to me is what these cookbooks are speaking to, and that's how they are political texts, not just culinary texts.
So I'm going to try to respect your political science discipline or your international relations discipline.
You don't have to at all.
I'm not following it, Fred. I'm very interested. I have a question that's historical, but I'm going to try to frame it in a way that respects the question you're asking. You started with this wonderful image of old Israeli food, and I think a lot of people in this room have had that experience, and the food of poverty and the food of the working pioneer and the food of whatever the hell we have here to eat, and there's not that much of it. Or there's plenty of it, but it's not that good. When you look at contemporary Israeli culture, and I would probably go back as far as the early 90s, where you had these waves of Yemenite restaurants, and then it was whatever the next restaurant was, and then the hummuserias, and and this is a little bit Jerusalem focused because that's kind of my perspective, but that whatever's hot is hot now, and then another thing is coming, and it's kind of more a food of, I don't want to call it wealth as opposed to poverty, but a food of access and openness as opposed to poverty, and that's where my question comes into you. When you talk about these English language cookbooks and these cookbooks that are telling a national narrative, they also seem to me to have some kind of an openness that's available as opposed to a closedness that was necessary. That part of my question is historical, and it may be that the answer to all of this is economic. When is there money, when is there not money? But how is the openness directed? Do you see a kind of export of high Israeli culture as a kind of means of articulating this national identity? Or do you think that there's more of a kind of back and forth that's going on here.
What do you mean by openness?
That's the word I'm trying to sort out with, and I don't mean it in any kind of moral or ethical way. I mean, it's more about access.
So access to different types of foods.
Yeah, and access to communication about those foods.
I mean, I think, I don't know if I don't answer your question, then come back.
Yeah. Because I mean it as a question about knowledge and experience, not as a question about whether you can find ketchup or not.
I mean,
or about the commercial production of knowledge about Israeli food as a national ideological project.
Well, the states definitely, I mean, the Israeli states have been clearly involved in that latter one through to the extent they supported, Israeli chefs representing Israel in culinary competitions. I haven't been paying attention to that for a few years.
But was that a crux? Was that one of the things that popped this open?
For me?
No. In terms of, is this openness of, okay, maybe I'm using openness very poorly, but is this exposure, is that driven by the government? Is that driven by the food itself? Is that driven by the geniuses? How is Israeli food, how is the marketing of national Israeli cuisine on an international scale something that we should understand?
I think that I think 2 notes here.
I'm sorry, I know it's a terrible question, but I'm actually trying to get somewhere and I'm not quite. Are you getting where I'm going?
We'll find out in a minute.
Okay.
So I think 2 things come to mind.
Yeah.
So one is how within Israel you end up with the acceptance of, I guess, conspicuous enjoyment. I mean, Ilan and I, we spoke about this years ago. Actually, I think in San Francisco, I think. Yeah. Where else? And the idea how, I guess, really after Oslo and the neoliberalization of Israel's economy, a space opened up where you would have people who had the culinary training and familiarity with local foodways, and a sufficient segment of the population is prepared to pay for that experience. And that's, I would say that's post-Oslo. I have such different memories, right? Like going to, there's a restaurant called Emsa in the middle of the road, which is not far from Hadera, where my mom's from, and we went there with my aunt and her father, and we were treated very well in this Arab restaurant because he was the famous spy, spied against Israel for the Soviet Union, so they liked him a lot. As opposed to, I think, one of the last time I was there when my cousin went to this just really amazing restaurant, I think might have been Casalia. I mean, it was just this totally different, culinary production of the level of, it's just a level of, it was a level of culinary sophistication that was well above and beyond anything that you're going to find at Amsterdam, which was kind of the norm, right? And that, I think that, but you have to be able to pay for that. It's so it helps, if you work for Apple, right, like my cousin does, you have to be able to have access to that, but also you have to want it, right? There has to be a place, for you to actually be interested in that culinary experience. In the UK, where I live in the Northeast, you go out, there's not a lot of very interesting foods because, for a lot of the local Northeast population, they're not open to it because they see it in class terms, right? Oh, that's too, upper class, too posh to be the language they use. And so there has to be something within Israel itself changed, right? And I think it's this, I think it's that changing of Israeli society away from the kind of, away from an identity based exclusively on chalutzim to an identity built upon a kind of American idea of consumerism and going out to eat whatever that is. And so that's one thing. The other one is this idea of culinary Zionism, which is some things we, Michal and I use the paper. And the point here is that political Zionism has succeeded, and cultural, the cultural Zionism has also succeeded as a part of this. One manifestation of cultural Zionism is culinary Zionism, which is the export of a new type of food that is Israeli, and that's a kind of cultural Zionist export, right? And I think that personally I find that just very interesting, and looking at the different types of foodways that combine to produce that, not just the ingredients, but the techniques, right? And, for me, you mentioned Jerusalem. I do not enjoy going to Jerusalem. It's really annoying how most of my kind of collaborators are all at Hebrew View and Mount Scopus, which is such a pain in the ass to get to. And as much as, I like walking around on, Having Sophim and seeing all the cardboard cutouts of Einstein everywhere, it's just not, you also can just see everything around there, the wall, walking through, Sheikh Java. For me, the one thing in Jerusalem that's worth going to is Cafe Kadosh, which is this very European-style bakery that's almost across the street from City Hall, and not that far from the old city. And it's a very, interesting, I think it's still probably the only kind. I haven't been in Israel for a few years, and I certainly don't go around looking at this sort of thing, but it's very unique, right? It's a European, Viennese-style coffee house that's clear, and it's been there for years, right? And there's techniques that are involved in that type of food, which is producing that food, which is very, very different type of techniques you need to produce knafe, for example, right? And also, but still having to work with local ingredients and produce something that actually, where the product actually works. Also, having to make that kind of pastry and heat is very difficult. So I don't know how they manage that. But that's part of the interest, I think, for me, is what are the different techniques, how are they being applied, and that's when we start looking at the regional foods as opposed to whatever our national food is, and what's the story that's being told there. And this is the story that we saw, or the stories that we saw. I don't know. I hope that helps.
So one question perhaps no is an answer as well. One question, sorry, is perhaps an answer. Did you see other cases that are similar? I was considering Israel studies not just about the Israeli ecosystem, but about how it relates to other cases in the region around the world. So can you talk about something similar with other actors, state actors? That's one. And I think it kind of follows on some of the comments that were made by Max. And again, pushing this a bit further, are we talking about state action? We talked about the state's power, the destructive nature of it. But is it state action here? All forms of Zionism, or eventually they had an institutional backing. There was kind of an ideological movement. There was an organization. There was a setting in place. There was a framework. These are individuals. They are kind of agents of whatever. But do they carry the same weight or the same logic of a Zionist movement? And the case in point is, we talk about food washing. Okay, we can talk about pink washing. This is something that the state of Israel does actively. The Israeli Foreign Ministry, for example, and Prime Minister would talk about extensively about the fact this is the most gay-friendly place in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. We can talk about greenwashing, the most advanced, and so on and so forth. Is this something that the state created or adopted? Is it free riding? Or is it just individuals as agents of whatever that is?
So the last question, it's not the state, and I'm building here on, I didn't throw out a lot of kind of sort of the jargony terms here, but it's building on, I guess, traditions of research that focus on what I would call the international relations of the everyday. Brent Steele and Ty Solomon refer to this as micro moves. They've done an article that talk a bit about it. So it's not the state. The state might be involved in some of these things, but no, we're not talking about the state as such, but it's practices it's mundane or everyday practices of non-elite populations that are reaffirming narratives of statehood, right? And it's that everyday element or that sociological element of the international that certainly most American honor ignores, but is, I think, something that really matters because I think one of the things that frustrates me about international relations as a field of study is it doesn't really, it has a habit of ignoring people. You know, you could, and I mean, this is a conversation that it makes it's kind of easier to have within, I guess, you know, critical IR communities, but sort of put it crudely, you could have, you could take an IR theory, apply it, know absolutely nothing about the countries that you're talking about, and still somehow produce a plausible explanation of that country's geopolitical behavior. And, you know, sure, I can do that. You know, I know the theories, you'll know the theories, right? And there's you know, benefits to doing that, but there's also weaknesses, and I think that if we exclusively think about IR in those kind of ways, we forget that there's a lot of other people who experience the international, and those experiences really matter. Now, some of the work on early feminist work in IR sort of highlight this. You know, Cynthia Enlow's work, you know, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, which talks about, you know, personal as international. You know, sort of when a pivotal text starts to do that. A lot of the post-colonial, decolonial stuff is doing this as well. You know, looking at experiences of the legacies of colonialism, indigenization. Curriculum work does this as well. But a lot of that literature rightfully is focusing on populations that have somehow been on, for lack of a better term, on the victim side of state power, state violence. And there's another element, though, you know, those who are not necessarily, they're not elite populations and they're not victims. And I think that I feel uncomfortable as a scholar if I'm only going to be speaking for those who have been on the receiving end of state violence, right? And there's, I think, a lot of ethical issues around doing that. I think that there's also really important questions about how non-elite and, you know, historically and structurally victimized people experience or participate in the international. And that's kind of what I try to do in my work with, you know, I don't know, limited success or in some cases, and probably greater success in others, I don't know. And that's, you know, that's what this article, you know, in International Political Sociology was doing, is looking at, here is a process of producing a particular international commodity that speaks to popular culture, right? And that was kind of the literature we were rounding our project in. And so, you know, does it carry the same weight of the state doing itself? Well, either it's, you know, if you're from, you know, if you're only teaching, you know, I don't know, Mearsheimer, Walton, Morgenthau in your classrooms, then probably no, it doesn't carry much weight. But if you're interested in other elements of the international, then it might carry just as much or more weight. But it depends what question you're asking. So, you know, is it state action? Usually no. Who is doing it? Well, everyday people, right? Does it carry the same weight? For them, maybe not. You know, they're not thinking about this way, but it matters, right? And you know, and I think that's, you know, that's kind of as far as I've gone, because I think the mattering itself is important. Other cases, yeah, I can start to think of other cases, but I haven't studied other cases, right? You know, I think,
for example, is there a case that Indian cuisine is trying to make, despite the regional diversity of the local food scene, as part of, I don't know, an Indian nationalist movement, or this trend now, Narendra Modi era kind of a...
I don't know if I don't think Modi's going to, I can't think Modi really cares about how, you know, Indian cookbooks are packaged in London. I mean, the whole, you know, at this point, the whole production of curry is such a well-known kind of colonial farce, as it were, that I don't think they care, at least not seriously enough, at least not yet. I don't know, maybe if he needs some other target, because, you know, his attempt to, you know, assassinate people in Canada isn't going well enough, he'll, you know, start to look at. But the thing is, it's hard to, off the top of my head, it's hard to think of that many contemporary examples, because a lot of this stuff now are legacy issues. They're not, I mean, Israel is still a relatively new state, you know, if we can, you know, sort of comparing it, right, to the United States or France. But, you know, if you look at, but if you look at the historical literature in food studies, you will almost always find that the idea of any specific food somehow not involving some kind of borrowing or appropriation is non-existent, right? I mean, even if you want to talk about Italian food, where are tomatoes from?
Right.
They're not Italian, they're from Mexico. And it's not hard to start to problematize, you know, nationalist claims to, you know, this is, you know, what our national food is. Partially why I bought that book on American cuisine, because I'm very interested in, you know, and what some of the foods he has to say. There's a really interesting article about, you know, Chinese food and, you know, basically New York brewery, right? And how, you know, the most Jewish food and, you know, is actually, you know, Chinese food, or, you know, and so, you know, there's no appropriation there, right? But there's clearly a very interesting, you know, intercultural exchange that's happening. But it's not the production of national cuisine, right? And, you know, probably could find if I thought about it, but I'm not a comparativist, so we didn't look. Yeah.
I think a good place to look, I think that's very intriguing. A good place to look is in the literature on nationalism.
With Billy?
What?
Billings work?
No, I don't know if that work. But in the literature on nationalism as it developed in Europe, and I'm a Europeanist, so I don't know about other parts of the world. But I mean, I do a little, but not very much. Cookbooks, food plays an important role, right?
Yeah.
You know, just as flags do, just as language does, you know, right? Zionism is a typical East European nationalism, right? Because it did what they all did. It created the language, it created, you know, a national mythology and so on and so forth. But, so I think it might be useful to look at the literature on food, but as I think about it, I actually don't know that any of the people who have studied nationalism in East Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, where, you know, it was a raging issue for many decades, have actually looked at food, because the food is extra-regional. I mean, everybody in all of those countries, people who are now live in the Czech Republic or Slovakia or Poland or Romania, whatever, they actually all eat the same food. And there are some regional variations, but they eat the same food. And so food doesn't become an example of creating the nation. So that's actually very interesting about Zionism, that food does become an issue. Right? Everybody eats schnitzel, including Israelis. Where did they take that from? Not from the Arabs, right? They took it from everybody in Central Europe who eat schnitzel, right?
So some of this is about movement, about getting.
Yeah, but even historically, right? In some countries, you know, France is different in this story. Italy is different.
Well, Italy doesn't have a national cuisine; it has regional cuisine.
It does, but but they're all like that, right? They all have France, but the idea is that, you know, there is the idea of Italian, you know, food and production of the you know, national identity in Italy is very important, right? It is very important in France. I remember seeing when I was in culinary school, chefs had this basically this history book of French cuisines, and yes, it is regional and there are differences. But I remember he had this book had pictures of menus from famous restaurants, primarily in Paris. And there was a menu from a Parisian restaurant just after the Revolution, and had very interesting dishes on it. Giraffe was listed. Why is there giraffe on this menu? Well, they couldn't get the food products that are normally used because of the revolution, so they were raiding the zoo. And, you know, that's so you're raiding the zoo to produce, you know, gastronomic levels of haute cuisine because it's so important, you know, to, you know, I don't know, français or something. And so I think that the historical food literature is really, really interesting.
Oh, I agree.
And it really dives deep into, local cookbooks, that communities put together, how, the different nuances that emerge. Also trade routes, and how the different trade routes speak to all sorts of different, shifts in various political structures. But there's also, and it highlights differences, right? In some countries, the gastronomic element is really important, and in others, it's not necessarily as important. I think the thing that's interesting, the thing I think that's really interesting about the Israeli case, and I don't know, I'm not going to suggest this is universal or anything like that, but the thing I think is really interesting in the Israeli case itself is, number one, it does really seem to offer actually a really powerful opportunity for some kind of significant food diplomacy, right? Like if there was a case where you should be able to get, right, different peoples who are in this really fundamental disagreement together to, that their contributions, their culinary contributions might allow them to say, yeah, I really love your food too, let's try to find some, area of common ground. And that's the basis of, kind of a lot of the, certain elements of food diplomacy or gas diplomacy. And simultaneously, it's largely ineffectual, right? The efforts never seem to go very far. And then they start to become jokes, right? So I think, to me, these are that sort of paradox is just revealing there is a very powerful story here that, as scholars of politics, we should be paying attention to, right? And maybe there's not a huge amount more we can say about this. I don't know. Gali and I have sort of talked about what we want to do next, if anything, but we obviously haven't. But regardless, it's a really powerful story, and it's still ongoing. And I think we should be paying some attention to this and not dismissing the political significance of food, right? At least for something that historians already know.
I agree.
Yeah.
Marcia and I are kind of taking up space, so if other people wanted to, okay, I'll ask my question.
Go for it.
I'm not sure exactly how this fits, but I have two more data points to comment on. The first is, and Ilan and I have talked about this before, is the Israeli developmental stage of travel. So the early 20s, post-army, travel outside of Israel, and whether especially I'm thinking about like Southeast Asia or South Asia, and the way that Israelis go away and come back, and they go away to a very specific set of places and come back. And those places have wonderful food, but you can also find signs in Hebrew to tell you to come and eat there. So there's a kind of local, global piece that's interesting. And the other piece I would add to that is people who have become religiously observant, the Baalei Tshuva, and the way that the Baal Tshuva movement creates a desire for previously unknown cuisines, like the American steakhouse phenomenon, or fried chicken, or other things that people had eaten when they weren't keeping kosher, which have become a kind of, in North America, an expensive cuisine, but which I think are also relevant in Israel. And maybe I'm wrong on that.
But I don't know much about that second example. Can you be a bit more precise, at least in the Israeli context?
Yeah, and I don't know, I'm thinking about an example that maybe doesn't work, but I was thinking about like the Asian food example, or the Oriental food, not Oriental in the sense of Middle Eastern, but the kind of fusion Chinese and other Asian restaurants, which could be a product of people having traveled in those places, but could also be about Israelis of American origin who ate Chinese food. You just got this look on your face.
Yeah. I think the traveling one, yeah. And we were talking with Gali about, we should do a project that explores, the different ways in which this, production of Israeli cuisine has been produced. But, I'm not sure which funding bodies are going to give us money to go around and, trying basically eating in a variety of restaurants, which is a bit of an issue. So if anyone has, knows of any, philanthropists that feel it would be really valuable to explore, different culinary techniques regarding, culinary Zionism, could you, let us
So
know?
perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. But the traveling abroad is huge. Right? It's huge in a few ways, right? One is you just identified, also you're experiencing other foods abroad, bringing them home, but also just training abroad, right? That's really big. And I think that the exporting of American culture to Israel is massive, right?
Yes, not just
And more so than other diaspora Jewish diaspora Aliyah, right? There's not, the different aliyot notwithstanding, the role of the role of American culture, American political culture in Israel cannot be underestimated. And this isn't, I would not say this is a very good contribution. I'm not sure how much of this, there's certainly an element of the food that's being brought over, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be, I don't really know. My gut is the types of food exports you're going to get from Americans to Israel. Would be things like does Bulgo Branch still exist?
Does what, right?
Which one?
Bulgo Branch. Remember that chain?
Bouillon, yeah.
Yeah.
It still exists.
On life support.
On life support, yeah. It's going to be stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Or
McDonald's
it's really cheap. Sorry, Starbucks hasn't never made it in Israel.
No,
Homa, right? Homa managed to keep them out. I think I remember. So one of my cousins really likes New York style cheesecake, which you can't get in Israel. Right. And so I was like, well, I was there after it happened on his birthday, so I'm going to make it. I'll make the New York style cheesecake. So I call my aunt and say, look, for Guy's birthday, I want to make him New York style cheesecake. But I can't do it at his house. Try to do it as a surprise. Can I do it in your house? And can you help me? Can you drive me around and get the ingredients? So we go to one supermarket, and I need to get Philadelphia cream cheese because I need a cream cheese that's upwards of 20% fat. And she's saying, you need a cream cheese that's upwards of 20% fat? Are you insane? You can't use this, right? She's, giving some Lebanon, which has got a fat content of like 2. And I'm saying, I can't use this. It won't work. And so we had to go, this becomes, a thing, so we put another one. Anyways, I ended up making New York style cheesecake, but so I think that, some of the, when you look at sort of the Americanization of, food in Israel that I remember, having not been there for a few years now, I don't really see it playing out in the kind of Israeli national cuisines that I've seen in Israeli cookbooks, right? I see it more in, okay, you can buy American brands at the supermarket, right? I think the ones the other one that's kind of interesting is the sort of additional street foods that you might find, around Dizengoff and these kind of like Southeast Asian sandwiches. They're not quite Vietnamese, but it's like sweet and sour stir-fried chicken and a baguette, and stuff like that. And the kind some of the foods that the Philippine guest workers are bringing in, and how that's obviously going to, at some point transform, some of the foods. But I haven't. It would be very interesting to see if future Israeli cookbooks started to include Philippine contributions, because they're not Jewish contributions, and
very much about class too.
I'm sorry.
Very much about class too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that creates another another interesting political dimension to how these different national cuisines are produced, because the foods are always regional, and even like kanafe is a really great example of this, right? To properly make it, you need this very specific cheese, which is very hard to get where else you have to make it. The picture which I had earlier on of that on one of this really breakfast with you know, the loud one in the middle, I have to make that myself. You know, it's not that hard to make, but I have to make it. You know, I can't buy it. And it's not going to be exactly the same because you can't get the same types of, you know, dairy products. And so, you know, these sorts of things do, you know, they do have, you know, they have a lifespan of their own, and it's interesting to see how they, you know, how they're going to play out. And, you know, maybe that's the next project. I think the biggest question for me is this sort of so what, right? If we can already highlight this is political, which is okay, it's obvious, and if we can already sort of highlight these different narratives, it's like, what's the next one? And I would be very interested in, you know, trying to develop some kind of research project about, you know, exploring the reasons for the change in Israeli cuisine, but, you know, I think without some sort of grant, it'd be very difficult to do that effectively. And, you know, funding being what it is really tough. So, yeah, I've had more success getting money to read dystopian fiction.
Follow the money.
Yeah.
All righty. Excellent. Dorothy, please, thank you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Great questions, everybody. The boring one is really good.
Thank you. You know, I was thinking,